Morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Caputi, and what I would like to discuss with you are various theories of collective responsibility, and I want to try to use these theories to work towards a new narrative of the Anglo-American invasion and occupation of Iraq that reframes the American public as a historical actor. And I say new narrative because most of the critical accounts of the war either see the public as a victim misled into war, or ignores the role of the public altogether, focusing on the actions of U.S. military and political leaders. The general narrative, usually goes something like this. The Bush administration seized the opportunity provided by the tragic events of 9/11 to propagandize an already fearful and traumatized public and lead them into war with Iraq, which had been a long-standing policy goal of neoconservatives within the administration and of corporations comprising the military-industrial complex. And with so many Americans overworked and economically precarious, with little free time to fact-check claims made by the Bush administration, and without the financial security to take any risks, few were able to challenge the case for war or participate in any meaningful form of resistance. That is the general narrative that I see in critical accounts. So for the lack of time, I'm only going to discuss the role of public opinion in supporting the war effort, and this is all hopefully leading towards a topic paper for my digital archive project, People's History of Fallujah. People's History of Fallujah is affiliated with the Islah Reparations Project, which is a California-based nonprofit organization that does grassroots reparations for communities harmed by our country's foreign policy. That is, rather than state reparations, we organize grassroots reparations. Using a framework developed by Dr. Kali Rubai, who unfortunately was supposed to be on the panel with us today, but she couldn't be here. And Kali notes that the first and most essential step in the process of repair is collaborative historical narration that includes the voices of our victims and involves the speech act of self-implication, in which we acknowledge our role in harming others and commit to repairing the harm done to the greatest extent possible. As such, People's History of Fallujah is not just dedicated to studying the US-led sieges of Fallujah. I also want this project to be involved in bringing reparations to the people we hurt. So this discussion that we're going to be having today is working towards a topic paper that addresses a central question to the case for reparations. What was the role of the American public in the invasion of Iraq? My conclusion, of course, is I believe the American public made causal contributions to the war, and I think we owe Iraqis reparations. But what I would like to explore with all of you is the reasoning behind this position. In particular, I'd like to discuss this notion of collective responsibility, which is fundamental to the very concept of reparations. Philosophically, it's a complicated and controversial concept. Many get nervous when they hear the phrase collective responsibility because it calls to mind situations like the US-led sacking of Fallujah, in which the entire city was collectively punished. But collective responsibility and collective punishment are not the same thing, and the concern that an endorsement of the former could lead to the latter is more about the potential misuse of the concept than the logic of it, right? So I'm interested in the moral philosophy of collective responsibility, which investigates whether groups can act collectively, do good or bad, and be blameworthy or praiseworthy as a group for that action. It's in fact a concept that we tacitly endorse all the time when we say things like, Monsanto pollutes, the Celtics lost the game, rich white men have defended their own power and privilege for centuries, attributing agency and responsibility to entire groups. So if you'll just bear with me for a moment, I would like to run very quickly through some of the theoretical questions involved in this debate. So contemporary moral philosophy has traditionally focused on the causal and moral responsibility of individuals. The dominant belief in the field is that only individuals are moral agents because groups don't possess the requisite center of consciousness in order to exercise the features of moral agency, like free will, moral deliberation, awareness of one's actions, and an understanding of the consequences of one's intended actions, right? So basically, philosophers just don't believe that groups are capable of intending to do anything. And then it follows that there is really no such thing as collective action. Instead, what might appear as a single group action is really an aggregate of individual actions, probably better termed as group behavior. I think the case for collective responsibility is easiest to see in groups where there's some form of deliberative body or channels of communication in decision-making. Excuse me. So a real-life example of this would be like any sort of military action coordinated by a chain of command. Or alternatively, policies that result from some form of collective practice. We might also see collective responsibility in groups without any communication or coordination between their members, so like a riot, or in the case of pollution. Or when harm or good is caused by some feature consciously endorsed by a group and participated in by every member, so like a society that endorses slavery or something like that. Another kind of scenario might be when every member of a group engages in some sort of collective practice, but it's the actions of one person that causes harm. So imagine a group that, thinks it's okay for everyone to drink and drive, and then one day a child is crossing the road, a drunk driver runs over the child, and we might ascribe responsibility to the entire group, even though it's just this one individual's actions that ended up causing harm. A group could even be responsible for collective inaction. So imagine a class of individuals who enjoy the vast majority of their society's wealth, while everyone else suffers in poverty. And they could easily alleviate that suffering, but they fail to redistribute that wealth. So you might think of that group as collectively responsible for not acting. One thing I would like to press on you is that I think the moral philosophy of collective responsibility can help us interpret primary sources to the extent that this is a theory that helps us think about how groups make causal contributions to complex events, and craft a narrative that helps us see our place as individuals and as a society within violent systems, while diffusing a lot of the sensitivity around issues of blame. I would also like to discuss a number of common tropes in journalism and histories of the Anglo-American invasion and occupation of Iraq. And I think these tropes tend to absolve the public of their agency in problematic ways. So in much of what has been written about the war so far, it's become commonplace to refer to the war as Bush's war, or to explain the war, the causes of the war, as a conspiracy orchestrated by the Bush administration with the collusion of the mass media. In fact, this was the title of the 2008 Frontline episode, Bush's War, that focused on the efforts of certain members within the Bush administration, notably Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who were searching for a pretext to include an attack on Iraq in the U.S. response to the tragedy of 9/11. And there is ample evidence to support this interpretation. I'm not arguing that the bulk of the blame for the war in Iraq shouldn't fall on the Bush administration, or that we shouldn't be especially critical about the role of the media in galvanizing the public to support the war. Just that we shouldn't be so easily satisfied with singling out a group of bad guys and not exploring the network of causes and contributing factors from our entire society. The shared trauma of 9/11 brought a number of very ugly impulses to the surface, such as Islamophobia and a desire for violent retribution against vague targets. And although this response was in some ways encouraged by the fear-mongering of our political leaders and the sensationalist media reportage, I don't think that this absolves us of our responsibility as a society for supporting the war. Imperial values are deeply entrenched in American culture. We all participate in the war economy. We're citizens of a democracy that is constantly at war with other nations. So as a society, we undoubtedly made causal contributions to the war. So the question is, if we are responsible as a society for invading a sovereign nation, waging an unjust war, followed by an illegal occupation, does this mean that we're all individually guilty and should feel shame? Another way to put the question is, does the guilt of the collective distribute to the individual members of the group? Philosopher Margaret Gilbert argues no, and believes there are factors, such as whether the individual was aware that the group's action was harmful, that should exempt them from blame if their ignorance was in no way blameworthy itself. There's other considerations too. We might be able to disassociate ourselves from collective responsibility by opposing our group's actions. But in our situation, what would this look like in practice in a society where militarism and imperialism are everywhere? Should I stay seated at every sporting event every time they parade troops out onto the field for the national anthem? Is it enough to vote Democrat? Or do I need to go as far as to get arrested at a protest to disassociate myself from the war effort? It's a difficult question to answer, but the presence of factors constraining the moral agency of ordinary Americans has led many scholars to absolve them of responsibility for the war altogether and focus on the actions of our political and military leaders. So, for example, I made a documentary film in 2013 titled Fear Not the Path of Truth, A Marine's Journey After Fallujah. And the film sort of discusses my efforts as a U.S. Marine veteran to better understand my role in the second siege of Fallujah, and which was one of the bloodiest and most criminal operations of the entire occupation of Iraq. So for the film, I did an interview with Noam Chomsky, and I asked him how it was possible that at the time I just was not aware that I was participating in war crimes. And Chomsky's response was that the American public is trained not to see such things, that we're brought to see our role in the world as exceptional and necessarily benevolent and just from a very young age, creating an ideological filter that screens out or obscures atrocities and war crimes. He then gave the example of My Lai. Take the Indochina War, he said, the major war crime of the post-Second World War era. Has anyone been charged for crimes? The only people charged were GIs who were out in the field, half-crazed GIs in a village where they didn't know who was going to shoot at them next. Yeah, they committed some crimes. The lieutenant at My Lai. But what about the guys in the offices who were sending them there, who were targeting the villages with B-52 raids? It's an incomparably worse crime. And My Lai was like a footnote. Yeah, sure, it was a crime, but you can't blame these guys. The ones to blame are the ones in the editorial offices, in the offices in Washington. All of us who see this and pretend we don't see it. And while I can agree that we should be extra critical of the powerful institutions in our society, since their power allows them to exercise their agency to a greater extent, and especially when their actions limit our ability to be fully competent moral agents, but I disagree that the crimes of the powerful absolve the rest of us of complicity. Yet this seems to be tacitly assumed in most critical accounts of the war. John Prados, a senior fellow for the National Security Archive, wrote in 2004 that the American people, subjected to a systematic effort to mislead, to frighten them into acquiescence, lost a measure of the checks and balances that hold back the dogs of war and are still paying the price in blood and treasure for Bush's folly. Again, while the Bush administration did indeed go to great lengths to select intelligence that supported their claim that Saddam Hussein posed an imminent threat to U.S. national security, and while also obscuring evidence to the contrary and marginalizing dissenting voices within the Pentagon and the State Department. It's a separate question, though, whether or not the U.S. public ought to be portrayed as a victim in this way. So, propaganda studies often regards propaganda as a purveyor of ideology, but it tends to focus on propaganda content and its effects. So drawing a straight line from one to the other, it's easy to conceive of the public as sort of a passive receptacle of propaganda. Obviously, it doesn't really work that way, but one thing that might make an audience more receptive to propaganda is when new information is integrated into salient ideological frames. So in the case of Iraq, we can understand how new information about WMDs or Saddam Hussein's dictatorial rule over Iraq can be made coherent with pre-existing beliefs about the Middle East and the benevolence of American intervention. So speaking of both Bush administration's propaganda and long-standing patterns of representing the Middle East in pejorative terms, Edward Said wrote that without a well-organized sense that the people over there were not like us and didn't appreciate our values, which is the very core of traditional Orientalist dogma, there would have been no war. Indeed, imperialist and racist ideologies are deeply entrenched within American society and have been before the so-called drumbeats of the global war on terror, another trope implying that the Bush administration seduced the American public into supporting the war. But what if we see the American public as participants and not followers of these drumbeats? Public opinion polls actually show a majority supporting the decision to go to war with Iraq from the start of the invasion on March 19, 2003 until December 2005, when finally a majority opposed or regretted the decision to go to war. The Pew Research Center estimates that 71% of the population supported the war in late March 2003. So do these polls reflect the success of propaganda, or do they reveal the reason the Bush administration's propaganda was successful? At what point are individuals blameworthy for holding beliefs that can cause harm to others? When are we culpably ignorant for accepting a belief when there is readily available information to the contrary? And did we do enough as a society to resist the war? I think that these are easy questions to answer, looking at the public as a collective, but far more difficult when considering the individual contributions made to this collective action. Of course, nothing can excuse the prevalence of racist, bigoted, or violent belief systems in our society. And as a society with relatively free media and free speech, with no threat of violence or imprisonment for dissenting views, and with abundant information contradicting the claims of the Bush administration, free and readily available on the internet or in public libraries, it's difficult to make the case that the American public was not in a position to understand that supporting the war could lead to unnecessary harm. And the number of Americans who actively resisted the war were always a small minority of the population. Yet again, critical accounts of the war often portray the Bush administration as acting in the face of mass opposition to the war. So, for example, historian Barbara Epstein wrote that in the early months of the war, the movement against the war in Iraq was the largest anti-war movement that has ever taken place. Even in the United States, where opposition to the war was not as large in other parts of the world, demonstrations against the war grew with astonishing rapidity. Before the war began, demonstrations had reached sizes that, during the war in Vietnam, took years of organizing to mobilize. And it is true that the protests on February 15, 2003 were the largest international anti-war protests ever, with an estimated 6 to 11 million people in at least 650 cities worldwide. But while 3 million gathered in Rome to protest the war, only 400 to 500,000 protested in New York City. And this, however, was the peak of the anti-war movement, which steadily declined until the 2008 presidential election, when many argue it ceased to be a movement altogether. John Tierman, Executive Director of MIT's Center for International Studies, argues that the gradual decline in support for the war occurred despite the absence of an anti-war movement of any size, and instead is attributable to two main factors: the growing number of American casualties and the growing body of evidence that the Bush administration had lied about the pretext for war. So concern for the harm that we had done to Iraq was not a significant factor in the declining support for the war, and active opposition to the war was hardly noticeable to those outside the anti-war movement after the events of February 15, 2003. However, this does not mean that each of us are bad people or the moral equivalent of war criminals. I suspect that one of the reasons that so many scholars and journalists have focused on the agency of our political and military leaders in bringing the nation to war is that they just don't feel there's anything to be gained in lecturing the public on their moral failings. Instead, they'd rather mobilize them against the powerful agents in our society. But I think that with some of the tools offered by these theories of collective responsibility, we can have a productive conversation about this while diffusing a lot of the dissonance that comes with talking about responsibility for the immense amount of harm. To this point, philosopher Keith Graham notes that we have very different moral responses to cases of imposing collective responsibility as opposed to cases of embracing collective responsibility. So Graham notes that imposing collective responsibility on individual members of a group often elicits feelings of moral repugnance, whereas cases of embracing collective responsibility, people often feel inspired when they see individuals or groups voluntarily take responsibility for, own up to, take action against, or make amends for some sort of collective action in which they feel partially responsible. And this is the impulse that drives grassroots reparations. The embrace of our collective responsibility as citizens of empire. So as a storytelling technique, I find it useful to begin with that individual speech act of self-implication, then to move on to contextualizing the individual contribution within a view of the systemic nature of the U.S. war machine, analyzing factors such as military-industrial complex, U.S. strategic communications and government media relations, racism and militarism in American culture, so on and so forth. And in fact, there's a documentary film that I think does this very well through its use of anecdotal stories, which are woven into the broader context of the war, titled Why We Fight, which came out in 2005. So this is one aspect of the work we're trying to do with the Islah Reparations Project, to build a community of people committed to this process of social repair with the communities that we harmed. And as I work on this project, I'm aware of the sensitivity of the topic and also of what is at stake. Americans are already inclined to historical forgetfulness. With recent films like Vice, which portrays the war as the product of the machinations of a handful of political extremists, I think it's easy for us to forget how we helped bring about the last war, forget about the people that we hurt, and be less prepared to stop the next one. Thanks.